Chapter 5. The Mail Order Prophet. What is whispered in your ear, shout from the rooftops. Matthew, chapter 10, verse 27. A vast range of figures professed their own versions of the New Thought gospel, and many succeeded in attracting readers and audiences. But a man called Frank B. Robinson holds a special place. From the onset of the Great Depression to the years immediately following World War II, this solidly built Idaho druggist used ads in newspapers, in magazines, and on the radio to craft nothing less than his own mail-order religious faith. He named it Psychiana, and its ideas were bedrock New Thought, packaged and sold to an audience of unprecedented proportions. Indeed, by the time of Robinson's death, he had amassed enough subscription-based followers, estimates ran as high as 2 million, with his lesson plans circulating through the hands of many more, to be able to claim stewardship over the 8th largest religion on the planet. And the best thing about it, he bragged to a wire service reporter, is that we guarantee results or your money refunded. I guess it's about the only money-back religion in the world. For all the sensation Robinson caused when he was alive, the man and his movement are found in virtually no major work of American religious history written in the last 40 years. And the college town of Moscow, Idaho, where Robinson began his rise to religious fame and ran his mail-order empire, now marks his memory only on the sign of a park he donated to the county. But Robinson's pioneering techniques as a media evangelist, particularly his early grasp of mail-order marketing and his ability to popularize mystical ideas, touched the nation in ways that have far outlived his organization. Indeed, the success of Psychiana revealed many Americans' hunger for practical and therapeutic religious thought during a period in which traditional congregations were shrinking. And his well-attended speaking campaigns emphasized themes of social equality and religious pluralism in an era when many American churches remained racially segregated. This is a story of triumph gained and quickly lost at the hands of a remarkably able and remarkably flawed religious leader. Within the folds of his successes and failures lies the history of the mystical religion that once swept America. I talked with God. Robinson's method was disarmingly simple, so much so that advertising executives doubted it could ever work. Beginning in 1928, he began taking out a series of ads in American magazines. I talked with God, they boldly proclaimed. Yes, I did, actually and literally. You too may experience that strange mystical power which comes from talking with God, and when you do, if there is poverty, unrest, unhappiness, ill health, or material lack in your life, well, the same power is able to do for you what it did for me. $20 in cash bought 20 staple-bound lessons in the power of affirmative thought, one arriving every 2 weeks. Within several years of his initial ad, Robinson had sold more than 500,000 lesson plans. Mainstream clergy had no idea what to think. Here was a heterodox teaching sweeping the American landscape, insisting that God power existed inside every man and woman and was available at each moment through the harnessing of thought. By contrast, many Americans found mainline pulpits unable to provide help or guidance during the Depression, when church-going continued a slide that had begun in the 1920s. The promise of Psychiana was open to all, no services, no confessionals, and no strict dogma. The sole commitment was to follow Robinson's densely packed, exclamation-marked lesson plans, which taught that, through a focused thought, you could satisfy every right desire. Word of mouth went Robinson's way, as many vowed that his mind-power system helped them find new jobs, sell or buy a home, or alleviate debt. It's so simple and easy, one Robinson student reported. "If it doesn't work, you can get your money back," another enthused. "As for the Psychiana theology, I just take what helps me," one said. Robinson kept up with thousands of correspondents who wrote him with personal questions or requests for prayer. Moscow's tiny post office was flooded with letters, sometimes addressed to only Psychiana, USA, or Dr. Robinson, Idaho, or even The Man Who Talked with God, Idaho. He proudly escorted journalists on tours of his Moscow headquarters, showing them correspondence from towns and cities all over America. From random mounds he would pull letters ranging from the touching tribute of a West Virginia homemaker who reported that she had purchased a new typewriter and refrigerator. "Your wonderful teaching has blessed me with a typewriter machine. I don't know much about type-ing, so please excuse all unspelt words." To heartfelt telegrams from men who had found work or recovered from illnesses. Several years before World War II, Robinson received a note of tribute from the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. After the start of the war, Robinson publicly responded to the ruler, urging that he refrain from joining Hitler in his crusade of madness. There came no reply. As war clouds thickened, Robinson, ever adaptable to the needs of the moment, reconfigured Psychiana as a spiritual army for Allied victory. Rallying his flock to what he termed a blitzkrieg for God, the Idaho prophet mailed followers buttons with Hitler's image, coupled with the vow, "I am helping to bring Hitler's defeat," by repeating hourly, "The power of right, God, will bring your speedy downfall." In 1939, Robinson cabled Finland's Prime Minister, Risto Ryti, with a plan for using mental affirmations to help repel Axis forces, proposing that Psychiana members, along with the Finnish cabinet and army, spend 15 minutes daily affirming, "The power of God is superior to the powers of war, hate, and evil." The embattled premier replied that he would enact Robinson's plan as soon as practicable. In the mail, in advertisements, in the news, everywhere one looked, it seemed, there was Frank B. Robinson. The Gathering Storm. For all the love of his followers, Robinson attracted equal invective from his critics. They called him a religious racketeer, a mail-order messiah, and a doctor of bunk. Indeed, Robinson's doctorate was from the College of Divine Metaphysics, an Indianapolis correspondence school. He claimed other diplomas, but could abruptly cut off questioners who dared to ask about them. "That's none of your business," he told one student in the question-and-answer column of Psychiana Weekly in 1941. On the national stage, the Postmaster General hit Robinson with 2 unsuccessful investigations for mail fraud. The federal government even began deportation proceedings after a rival publisher accused Robinson of lying about his birthplace on a passport application. But the ensuing hearings served only to build Robinson's reputation as a fighter. "If you want to make anyone, persecute them," he wrote in his 1941 memoir, The Strange Autobiography of Frank B. Robinson. Indeed, with every assault from the press and pulpit, his presence seemed only to grow. By the 1940s, Robinson turned out articles, newsletters, books, and pamphlets at an incredible pace. Between direct mail solicitations and print advertising, his Psychiana pitches reached an estimated 12 million homes a year, roughly a third of all American households. His lectures ran on more than 80 radio stations. It was, observed religious journalist Marcus Bach, as though a prophet had spoken in his own country. Whether a prophet, Robinson didn't quite have his own country. In fact, Robinson's murky origins formed the basis of a deeply troubled childhood and of problems that would haunt him later in life. A wandering prophet. Nothing about Robinson's birth is quite clear, except for the agreed-upon year, 1886. He was born to a hard-drinking English minister, though whether in England or America, where his parents were traveling, is a matter of dispute. Regardless of his native land, Robinson and his 3 younger brothers grew up in ice-hard circumstances. At 8 years old, Robinson watched his mother, Hannah, die of pneumonia in the bedroom of their row house in Halifax, England. After Hannah's death, Robinson's father, a Baptist firebrand with a bad temper and a taste for liquor, turned on his sons with a vengeance. Punishments were frequent and brutal. But it was when the Reverend J. H. Robinson remarried, Robinson wrote in a rare understatement that the real trouble began. The Robinson boys fought so bitterly with their stepmother that arguments exploded into physical fights. Robinson's father decided to enlist 13-year-old Frank in the British Navy, a fiasco that lasted about 6 months, when the youth jumped ship and fled back home. Determined to push him from the house, the elder Robinson then packed up 14-year-old Frank and his 12-year-old brother, Sidney, put the equivalent of $5 in their pockets, and sent them off on a steamer to Canada. The only arrangement the minister had made for them was a letter of introduction to a Baptist preacher who lived 800 miles from where the boys docked. Upon reaching their intended sponsor's home one Sunday morning, the penniless, bedraggled boys were shooed away, left to sleep in a hayloft. Eventually, Frank and Sidney found jobs in farming and livestock. When Sidney fell ill with the same disease that had killed their mother, the boys wired back home to their dad, and were told they were on their own. Sidney survived, but the years that followed were no easier. As time passed, Frank Robinson discovered a crippling habit: binge drinking. In what must be a record, the young Robinson earned the distinction of being kicked out of the British Navy, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and eventually the U.S. Army and Navy for drunkenness and bad conduct. But friends and employers detected the spark of something unusual in the young Robinson. He was strikingly handsome and articulate, and came across as surprisingly educated for someone who had never made it beyond grade school. In his early 20s, Robinson captured the attention of a Toronto millionaire, who offered to put him through Baptist seminary. Under the sponsorship of a group of local businessmen, Robinson entered McMaster University's Bible training school in Toronto. But the Bible student immediately clashed with teachers and ministers. During a meeting with his benefactors, Robinson insisted that Eastern and pre-Christian religions had their own stories of humanity's fall from grace and even of a crucified Savior. Why, he asked them, should any one religion hold a monopoly on truth? Other religions had their Bibles too. They had a different crucified God. Some of these crucified gods were so similar to the Christian's crucified God that logic and reason must admit that the story of the later God was either stolen or copied from the older God. I did not want the Christian God. I wanted the God of the entire universe. When the meeting ended, Frank B. Robinson was once again on his own. A search bears fruit. Always a quick study, Robinson became a registered druggist and found steady work for the first time behind a pharmacy counter in Klamath Falls, Oregon. He married the well-regarded daughter of a circuit court judge, and his new wife guided him into sobriety and a stable home life. In order for Robinson to accept a better job, the couple moved to Los Angeles, where they had a son. By age 42, Robinson finally seemed to be calming down, but his search for God had left him with a lasting sense of emptiness. Then one Sunday morning, everything changed. Robinson attended a Methodist service on Wilshire Boulevard. In the massively ornate church, with its plush carpets and oaken pews, he counted only 26 worshippers. Something in mainstream religion was dying, he thought. he returned home and sat alone in his room. Dejected with the Baptist faith of his youth and uninspired by the religious offerings of the present, the no longer young man felt his search for meaning had been a waste. On that day he pleaded to be shown something more, challenging God to reveal himself. "Oh, God," he cried, "if I have to go to hell, I'll go with the consciousness that I went there earnestly trying to find you, God." Rather than feeling hopeless, however, Robinson found that a strange sense of peace settled over him. He felt powerful, yet relaxed, as though lifted to some higher place. He later said that he sensed the Spirit of God pulsing within him, as though it filled his veins and arteries. Robinson came to reason that, through the right exercise of thought, this holy power could be tapped as a limitless resource. He determined to spread his vision of a workable, usable God. It was do-it-yourself thinking taken to the furthest extreme, an audacious, heretical, and profoundly American approach to religion. And, however the jacket-and-tie-clad druggist viewed himself, his belief in harnessing the forces of an unseen world placed him, like other practitioners of mind-power metaphysics, directly in the steps of America's occult tradition. With plans bursting in his head, he moved with his wife and young son to the 5,000-person town of Moscow, Idaho, near Spokane, Washington. Moscow's 19th-century settlers had called it Hog Heaven for its abundance of flora favored by pigs. But by the time the Robinson family arrived, it was a bustling community with a neatly ordered main street and served as the home to the University of Idaho. Robinson's sole purpose in moving there was to accept a job at a pharmacy that closed at 6 p.m. Punching out early allowed the corner drugstore's new counter clerk to begin writing out the concepts of his new psychological religion. Beginning one Saturday night, Robinson sat at a borrowed Corona typewriter and pecked the keys for 36 hours straight. When he stopped, he had the lesson plan that would deliver the God law into the hands of ordinary people. But he needed a way to reach them. Now a family man, Robinson's roused-about days were behind him. He could no longer pick up and roam the nation. National advertising was a new enough medium to still seem revolutionary, and it struck him as the perfect vehicle. His would be a mail-order faith. Approaching everyone from a local highway commissioner to a grocery clerk, he pulled together $500 and visited an advertising agency in Spokane, the nearest city. They told him not to waste his money. So on his own, Robinson spent $400 and placed a single ad in Psychology magazine. "I talked with God. So can you. It's easy." Even Robinson was surprised when the one notice attracted 5,000 replies and ultimately netted $13,000 in cash. He wasted no time in seizing the momentum. In newspapers, magazines, and radio stations all over America, Robinson proclaimed Psychiana a money-back religion, promising unlimited potential or a full refund to anyone who tried it. Within the first decade, he secured 600,000 paying subscribers, spanning 67 nations. His direct mail ads, consisting of detailed pamphlet-length espousals of Psychiana theology, began entering 2 to 3 million households a year. So was born a mass movement. The Psychiana Method. Robinson took a bold tack on religion, insisting that its results should be measurable and provable. Hence, hopeful students and more than a few critics wondered, did Robinson's ideas work? Religious historian Charles S. Braden knew Robinson and wrote about him in the 1940s. One of the few scholars to take any note of Psychiana, Braden remarked on how Robinson's lessons had a way of awakening through the power of suggestion a lively sense of expectancy in the student. Enthusiasm, as Carl Jung once noted, is the hidden key to the effectiveness of any belief system. In his classic study, The Varieties of Religious Experience, William James found that a dramatic conversion could alter a person's character, objectively changing the circumstances of his outer life. On a similar scale, Psychiana, like other positive thinking philosophies, could awaken new thoughts, ideas, and options, with the results seeming veritably magical at times. Even in the 21st century, surrounded by an endless stream of self-help programs and practical spiritual ideas, it is still possible for a sympathetic reader to get swept up in the tone of portent and certainty that permeates Robinson's first lesson. In it, he encouraged the repeated use of his key mantra, "I believe in the power of the living God." Other affirmations quickly followed. "I am more and more successful." And Robinson prescribed simple, specific methods, such as closing one's eyes at night before falling asleep and meditating on a white spot, the veil that, he told students, separates humanity from the divine. Although he would claim his ideas were wholly original, he stood on the shoulders of an already well-established spiritual philosophy, American-style New Thought. While freshly articulated, Robinson's techniques were the same as those that had been attracting American seekers to the philosophy of affirmative thinking since the late 19th century. And like New Thought, Psychiana had difficulty providing ethical depth. "If just any need can be met," asked the historian Braden, "does not that open the way to selfishness, which is the antithesis of the Christian ideal?" Indeed, Robinson tended to dodge most moral questions, insisting that if someone is in touch with the God power, that person will naturally do what is good. Yet Robinson never defined his concept of the good life, at least not beyond Sunday school injunctions toward clean living and general fair play. In so doing, he often sounded much like the mainstream religionists he had vowed to overthrow. Of money and spirit. At times, Robinson's own life begged questions of not only his ethics, but of his ability to understand how critics saw him. In his autobiography, Robinson launched into a gleeful description of how he once snookered a drugstore client into purchasing gallons of useless mineral oil. He had related the same story several years earlier to a Time magazine reporter. The lack of moral embarrassment with which Robinson reported this petty con job could only leave a reader to wonder. In the final analysis, did Robinson really believe in the power of the living God? Or was he, as the evangelical Bible banner charged in 1941, a pious fraud out to sell the gift of God for money? There is no question of Robinson's love for things material. Heavy-set and more than 6 feet tall, he cut a dramatic figure on the streets of Moscow, Idaho, in mink coats, fancy suits, broad-brimmed Stetson hats, a chain watch, and a pipe. He proudly posed for photographs, standing beside the latest model cars. But surviving financial records reveal a subtler story than most critics understood. Psychiana never made millions. Most of its receipts, which were in the hundreds of thousands annually, flowed back into the business for the constant postage and print and radio advertising needed to keep the operation afloat. While financial documents show bountiful growth early on, Psychiana sustained a cycle of boom and bust years and was losing money toward the end. Time magazine reported in 1938 that Robinson's operation had amassed record sales of $400,000 in 1934, more than doubling the receipts from 2 years earlier, according to records archived at the University of Idaho. But by the end of that decade, sales had dipped to about 1/4 of their high mark. A 1939 profit and loss statement reproduced in the Sunday Oregonian showed receipts dropping to a modest $46,331 for the first 7 months of that year, exceeded by expenses, mostly in advertising, of $54,556. Robinson himself never collected more than a good white-collar salary. Records show that his compensation rose significantly between 1932 and 1939, when it climbed from $500 to $750 a month. For 1939, the last year that partial figures are available, his annual pay would have amounted to $9,000, the equivalent of $130,000 today. By contrast, many times that amount flowed yearly to another religious controversialist and quasi-mystical figurehead named Arthur Bell, known to followers in the 1930s as The Voice. Bell founded the California-based Mankind United, a prosperity cult and conspiracy club that foretold the rise of a social spiritual utopia in which all chosen men and women, Mankind United members, would live in material comfort and bliss. Bell told of being directed by a council of unseen sponsors who secretly waged war against money changers and hidden rulers who would enslave humanity. Thousands of lonely, directionless, and often elderly folk took his bait and plied Bell with membership fees, life savings, and often free labor in his roster of businesses. In the process, the handsome Bell, a frequenter of nightclubs and owner of multiple apartments and mansions outfitted with swimming pools, wet bars, and draped oriental love seats, amassed millions in assets tax-free. Nothing like that existed for Robinson, who lived with his wife and 2 children in an understated brick colonial in Moscow. So if Robinson was not profiting at quite the level detractors suggested, what drove him? Did the man derided as a doctor of bunk believe in his own message? There is good reason to conclude that he did. The sheer volume of Robinson's writing, a mixture of unmitigated passion and arguments over fine points of theology, suggests a figure motivated by deep conviction. In his 23 books and thousands of pamphlets, flyers, and articles, Robinson was constantly on the lookout for new ways to verify his ideas, searching for ever-sharper means of codifying his system. Robinson was unafraid of showing emotion. He wept openly in front of visitors to his Moscow home while playing them his favorite gospel hymns on his personal pipe organ. He argued intensely about the shortcomings of the mainline faiths, one night debating a living room filled with ministers to a standstill for a full 3 hours. Among the most moving testaments to Robinson's conviction came from his son, Alfred, an Ivy League student and Navy bomber pilot in World War II. Journalist Marcus Bach remembered their encounter. I met Alfred, Robinson's son, after his graduation from Stanford. When he told me he was joining his father in the Psychiana movement, I asked him if he would be using the affirmations in his own work. I was brought up on them, he smiled. One of my earliest recollections is that of my father taking me for a walk in the woods. He went on intently. When we reached a secluded spot, Father would stop and say, "Let's be still. Listen. You can hear the presence of the Almighty." Often, when he was alone, he would shout in a loud voice, "I believe in the power of the living God." The critics were wrong, at least on this count. Robinson really did seem to believe in his ideas, and his way of thought went beyond Psychiana theology alone. At a time when Hitler's blitzkrieg threatened to engulf the world, Robinson, in a short-lived collaboration with Science of Mind founder Ernest Holmes, displayed a deeply felt and even prophetic instinct for religious tolerance and plurality. It would become the New Thought movement's finest hour. American Spiritual Awakening. There is one known surviving photograph from an event now forgotten in the annals of American religion. It shows 2 men, Ernest Holmes seated on the left, Frank Robinson seated on the right, smiling gently at each other across the stage of the Philharmonic Auditorium in Los Angeles. A packed crowd of 3,500 looks on. While not visible from the photograph, a banner draped across the stage proclaims Robinson's key aphorism: I believe in the power of the living God. The year was 1941, and the two spiritual leaders were rallying the faithful for a series of 5 meetings that Robinson called the American Spiritual Awakening. It was a kind of spiritual booster rally before America's entry into World War II. But the resulting program turned into something more. An affirmation of the universality of all religious beliefs and national backgrounds, moving one columnist for the West Coast African-American newspaper The Neighborhood News to write, "If it does for you what it has done for me, you would not take $100 for attending this meeting." Looking back on a moment in history when ethnic hatreds and fascist ideology were plunging nations into war and many American churches remained segregated, the message of plurality that pervades the surviving transcripts of the Robinson Holmes mission seems pioneering. Ernest Holmes opened the first meeting on Sunday, September 21, 1941, leaving no mistake as to his feelings for his co-speaker. Dr. Robinson calls his work Psychiana, which means bringing spiritual power to the world. I happen to belong to a movement called religious science, which means the same thing. Some of you may go to a Jewish synagogue. You may be a Methodist, Baptist, Catholic, but there is but one God. We meet here today not on a theological background, but upon the foreground of a spiritual conception, the common meeting ground of every race, every creed, every color, every philosophy, and every religion on the face of the earth. Calling their racially mixed audience beloved, Robinson extended Holmes' remarks the next day. "Now, beloved, when the Almighty created the human race, he created black, white, yellow, and every other color which exists on earth in one creation. He did not make 3 or 4 special jobs of creation, nor did he make several different attributes, one for each nation. He made them all flesh and blood, every human soul that has ever lived on the face of this earth. We are all brothers, regardless of our religious affiliation, our race, or nationality." While known as a political conservative, Robinson ardently opposed the New Deal and supported each of the Republican challengers to Franklin Roosevelt. Here was a religious leader who, together with Holmes, was making social statements that would not become common fare for at least another 25 years. The 5-day series was so popular that Robinson made a return engagement 3 weeks later, and he and Holmes drew up arrangements for Holmes's seminary, the Institute of Religious Science in Los Angeles, to offer graduate training to students who had already passed through the Psychiana lessons. It was the start of a plan to certify Psychiana teachers and practitioners for a nationwide congregational mission that would take Psychiana beyond its reliance on mail-order lessons or the pronouncements of its charismatic chief. Joint advertising literature was printed, featuring Robinson and Holmes together, with the headline, "When you have decided to enroll for this teachers and practitioners course, both Ernest Holmes and Dr. Robinson will help you." In the end, however, the Holmes-Robinson partnership became little more than a reminder of what might have been. Robinson showed little interest in the face-to-face management of a congregation, preferring instead to work privately on his books, lessons, ads, and radio addresses. Holmes had a growing flock and network of churches and was easily engulfed in his own organizational affairs. The two men drifted apart. It is one of the more intriguing what-ifs of 20th-century religious history to consider the possibilities had they remained together. Between Robinson's millions-strong reach and Holmes's well-established seminary and churches, it is possible that Psychiana might have survived the death of its founder, perhaps becoming the galvanizing force of New Thought's disparate flock. But by the time of Robinson's death, about 7 years from the day that he and Holmes first spoke together, the organization foundered and then collapsed. Remains of the day. A large, athletic man, Robinson nonetheless had a weak heart. A series of cardiac failures in the mid-1940s caught up with him on October 19, 1948, when he died at 62. Shocked followers flooded the Psychiana offices with telegrams of condolence, mourning the man who many said gave them a fresh start in life. Where, some wondered, would the movement find its new voice? Robinson's son, Alfred, stepped forward to run the operation, but he lacked the obsessive passion that drove his father. With new students dwindling and bills mounting, the family closed Psychiana's doors by the end of 1952. The memories quickly faded. When the Daily Idahonian, which the Robinson family partly owned, ran a history of the town of Moscow in 1961, not one word appeared about Frank B. Robinson or Psychiana. It was as if neither had ever existed. What caused Psychiana's abrupt fall? Several factors seem paramount. With the exception of his son, Robinson cultivated no deputies, and, in the absence of independent congregations, no leaders emerged naturally. He was a messenger without apostles. Unlike figures such as Ernest Holmes and Wallace D. Wattles, Robinson had self-published all his own books and pamphlets. Hence, no outside organization stood to benefit from the sale and maintenance of his written work after he was gone. And the last factor is perhaps the most important. Robinson succeeded to the extent that other larger religious movements copied his outreach methods and self-help message and eclipsed his one-man operation. It was no longer a sin, journalist Marcus Bach observed, to personalize the faith and make it serve the needs and wants of man. In the end, the Times had caught up with the miracle man of Moscow. Robinson, perhaps more than any other figure of his day, understood that mainstream Christian churches either had to address the problems of daily existence or risk irrelevance. Sounding a lot like Robinson, ministers and religious commentators of the late 1940s and early 1950s began to discuss the possibilities of advertising and the importance of serving the everyday needs of congregants. In 1946, Rabbi Joshua Loth Liebman published the first religious therapeutic classic of the post-war era, Peace of Mind. Within a few years arrived Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking. Where Robinson had called for a workable, usable God, Peale wrote, "Christianity is a practical, usable way of life." And the trend was set. The American pulpit was now expected to address workaday concerns. Indeed, the books and sermons emanating from the 21st century's mega-churches abound in the how-to appeal that marked the Robinson approach. Life coaching, prosperity lessons, marriage counseling, and even weight loss programs are standard fare in the nation's largest congregations. In his revolutionary use of radio, print, and mail-order marketing to spread a religious idea, Robinson was arguably the first media evangelist of the 20th century. But he was more than just that. He was perhaps a figure possible only at a certain moment in American history, someone with a deeply held conviction, a few $100s in ad money, and a fresh vision of spiritual life that spoke to a vast, neglected flock. Robinson believed and lived out his message, rising from decrepitude to achievement, providing not just a set of ideas, but a personage in whom people from all walks of life could vest their hopes. Writing in 1963, at a point by which Robinson's name had already faded, historian Charles S. Braden captured the heart of the mail-order prophet's work. He used to advertise in the most unlikely places, on match covers, for example, which might be found in a saloon, or a brothel even. And many a man and woman found some new hope when they answered the ad of the man who had talked with God. He more nearly followed the injunction of Jesus to go out into the highways and hedges and bring them in than probably any other man on the contemporary scene. Chapter 6. Go Tell Pharaoh, The Rise of Magic in Afro-America. They came to Marah, but they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it in the water, and the water became sweet. Exodus chapter 15, verses 23 through 25. Frederick Douglass had no use for fantasies or folklore. Born a slave, he was separated as a young child from his mother, a woman who walked miles from another plantation for the rare occasion of rocking him to sleep or giving him a hand-made ginger cake. He grew to be a self-educated teenager, determined not to play the role of whipped dog to a cruel overseer. But in January 1834, on the eve of his 16th birthday, Douglass found himself delivered into the hands of the worst of them, a Mr. Covey, known as the Breaker of Negroes. A few years earlier, Douglass had been a domestic servant in Baltimore. There the burdens of slavery, the hunger, the beatings, the daily humiliations, were at least tempered by the surface civilities of city life. Indeed, his Baltimore mistress had taught him to read, until the lessons were stopped by his master. "If you teach that nigger how to read," the man told his wife, "there would be no keeping him." But Douglass discovered ways to keep educating himself through whatever books or newspaper scraps could be found. Soon, however, the Baltimore family rearranged its household, and Douglass was abruptly returned to plantation life. His new master in St. Michael's, Maryland, was suspicious. Could a young man who had tasted city living still work the fields? To be brutally certain, at the start of 1834 he loaned out Douglass for a year to Edward Covey, a petty, cruel farmer who used every opportunity to beat his new charge on trumped-up offenses. The beatings became so severe that by August, Douglass sneaked back to his old St. Michael's master to beg for protection. His plea was rejected, and the youth, still bruised and caked with blood, was turned back to Covey's farm. Once there, he hid all day and into the night in the woods outside Covey's fields, not knowing what to do. The days that followed, however, turned out differently than anyone could have imagined. To the shock of Covey, Douglass did return to the farm, and when beatings came, the youth stood up and fought back. For 2 hours one morning the men struggled, and Covey could not get the better of him. Embarrassed by his inability to control a teenager who finally said enough, the slave master was forced to back down. For Douglass, it was a moment of inner revolution from which he would never retreat. His act of self-defense had freed him in mind and spirit, leaving him to wait for the opportunity when he would finally be free in body as well. It is one of the most remarkable emancipation narratives in American history. Yet tucked within the folds of Douglass's inner revolution there lies another, lesser-known drama. It arises from deep within African-American occult tradition, and it is an episode that Douglass would revise and downplay between the time when his earliest memoirs appeared in 1845 and when he published a more widely read account a decade later. It is a window on magic and slave life. And to find it, we must return to the darkened woods outside Covey's farm. The Magic Root. As Douglass hid in the woods on Saturday night, he was discovered by another man in bondage, Sandy Jenkins, someone Douglass described in his memoirs as an old adviser. Sandy, he wrote in 1855, was not only a religious man, but he professed to believe in a system for which I have no name. He was a genuine African, and had inherited some of the so-called magical powers, said to be possessed by African and Eastern nations. Sandy Jenkins was a root worker. He practiced an African-American system of magic and folklore that drew deeply upon Western and Central African religious tradition, Native American herb medicine, and sources as diverse as Jewish Kabbalah and European folklore. It was called hoodoo. White observers would often mistake it for the Afro-Caribbean religion properly called Vodou in Haiti and Voodoo in the American South. particularly in Louisiana, the home to voodoo's 19th-century high priestess, Marie Laveau. Reporters and anthropologists would routinely conflate voodoo and hoodoo, but the two were very different. The religion of voodoo grew from the traditions of the Fon and Yoruba peoples who occupied the West African coastal states. These were the men and women of the Middle Passage who were hurled into slavery throughout America and the Caribbean. In the Fon language, the term Vodou meant deity or spirit. The Fon Yoruba practices also morphed in the religion of Santeria, an Afro-Caribbean and today increasingly American faith that often associates ancient African gods with Catholic saints. In Santeria, for example, the great spirit Babaluai, guardian of health and sickness, is frequently associated with Saint Lazarus, a patron to the ill. This is the same Babalu that Cuban bandleader Desi Arnaz serenaded to the unknowing ears of I Love Lucy audiences. Hoodoo was not a bastardized voodoo or Santeria. It was something with roots all its own. The way we tell it, wrote novelist and folklorist Zora Neale Hurston in her 1935 Mules and Men, hoodoo started way back there before everything. Nobody can say where it begins or ends. In practice, hoodoo draws heavily upon botanical and household items, plants, soaps, minerals, animal parts, perfumes, objects that a displaced people adapted to find their way back to the old rituals and spirits. Sandy Jenkins and other root workers were so named for their virtuosity with herbs and roots, objects believed to hold hidden powers that could be tapped for protection, healing, love, money, and other practical needs. And here we return to the first narrative of Frederick Douglass. He receives advice, and something more, from Sandy in the woods. He told me with great solemnity I must go back to Covey, but that before I went I must go with him into another part of the woods, where there was a certain root, which, if I would take some of it with me, carrying it always on my right side, would render it impossible for Mr. Covey or any other white man to whip me. He said he had carried it for years, and since he had done so, he had never received a blow and never expected to while he carried it. I at first rejected the idea that the simple carrying of a root in my pocket would have any such effect as he had said, and was not disposed to take it. But Sandy impressed the necessity with much earnestness, telling me it could do no harm if it did no good. To please him, I at length took the root, and, according to his direction, carried it upon my right side. There is no record to bear the matter out, but the object Sandy pressed upon Douglass was very likely a rock-hard, bulbous root, known within hoodoo as John the Conqueror, or sometimes High John. John de Conquer is the pronunciation found in oral records and song. It is the ultimate protective object, used for everything from personal safety to virility, traditionally carried by a man rather than a woman. In the magical tradition of like bestows like, the dried root is shaped like a testicle. There is historical conflict over the species of the root. Botanical drawings differ among the catalogues of old hoodoo supply houses. But the most careful observers and practitioners of hoodoo today agree that the likeliest source is the jalap root, which dries into a rough, spherical nub. Armed with what he warily called the magic root, Douglass set off for Covey's farm. Expecting God only knew what fate, he received a strange surprise. It was now Sunday, and Covey, ever the upright Christian, was downright polite. Now, wrote Douglass in his first memoir, this singular conduct of Mr. Covey really made me begin to think that there was something in the root which Sandy had given me. But on Monday morning things darkened. Mr. Covey, it seemed, was a Sunday Christian. Once the Lord's day of rest ended, the devil in him returned. On this morning, Douglass continued, the virtue of the root was fully tested. Covey grabbed Douglas in the barn, tied his legs with a rope, and prepared to beat him. Mr. Covey seemed now to think he had me, and could do what he pleased. But at this moment, from whence came the spirit I don't know, I resolved to fight. Here began the historic turnaround in Douglas's life. I now resolved that, however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. 10 years later, in 1855, Douglas, now a free man and internationally known as the voice of abolitionism, published his revised and expanded memoir, one that sold an extraordinary 15,000 copies in 2 months and helped galvanize anti-slavery feelings. Douglas's second memoir repeats yet subtly alters the episode involving Sandy, Covey, and the Root. When grabbed by Covey, Douglas writes with emphasis in the original, "I now forgot my roots, and remembered my pledge to stand up in my own defense." In a detail absent from his first memoir, Douglas notes that on the previous day he had made a personal vow to protect myself to the best of my ability. Gone now was the observation. From whence came the spirit I don't know. Was Douglas some kind of a half-believer in hoodoo, intent on covering his tracks? Not exactly. The greater likelihood is that the same man who served as the moral anchor of the abolitionist movement wanted no one to misunderstand the true nature of his life story. His was an inner triumph, a realization of personhood against inconceivable odds, a transcendence in thought that permitted him to see himself as a man of agency and as an actor possessed of rights under God. Indeed, Douglas, a proponent of education and self-improvement in the deepest sense, would almost certainly have considered hoodoo and folk magic as distractions at best, and at worst as chains of delusion. In an 1845 footnote that he also repeated 10 years later, Douglas distanced himself from the question of hoodoo and magic. This superstition, root work, is very common among the more ignorant slaves. A slave seldom dies, but that his death is attributed to trickery. But in both his earlier and later memoirs, Douglas proved resolute in his unwillingness to slam shut the door on the matter or to qualify the veneration he felt for Sandy. "I saw in Sandy," Douglas wrote in 1855, "too deep an insight into human nature, with all his superstition, not to have some respect for his advice, and perhaps, too, a slight gleam or shadow of his superstition had fallen upon me." Sandy, the clever soul, the old adviser, and the genuine African, provided a rare measure of wise counsel in a chaotic and brutal world. His authority was grounded in an occult tradition that no slaveholder could enter. In this way, above all others, was Sandy a man of magic, a medicine man in the most profound sense. Mojo bags and menorahs. By the early 20th century, Americans were becoming widely accustomed to buying their household items from commercial catalogs, or right off the shelf. And magic made for no exception. Where others would see rows of ordinary drugstore products, hoodoo practitioners saw the raw material for spells. For instance, Octagon bar soap, still marketed by Colgate as a budget cleanser, was scented with the all-important ingredient lemongrass, a key hoodoo formula for spiritual cleansing or exorcising homes of bad humors or maleficent spirits. The earthy scents of Florida or Kananga toilet waters were used for household protection, as fragrant altar offerings, or for the honoring of the dead. Hoyt's cologne was a favorite for gambling luck. Richly illustrated spiritual supply catalogs came to sell items of a more specialized nature, such as lodestones, a favorite money-getting talisman, mojo bags, magical concoctions of herbs in small red flannel sacks to be carried on one's body, and a wide variety of roots, herbs, charms, and amulets. The commercial hoodoo supply houses, which included Keystone Laboratories of Memphis and the Valmore Products Company of Chicago, were operated by pharmacists and cosmetics dealers, often first- or second-generation Jewish immigrants to urban areas, who were among the few white retailers catering to a black clientele. In a spirit of why not, the catalog dealers remarketed Judeo-Christian devotional items as occult supplies, such as menorahs, the traditional Jewish candelabra, and mezuzahs, encasements for prayer scrolls to be nailed at the front door of Jewish homes. Black and white customers gamely stocked their homes with Jewish, Catholic, spiritualist, Hindu, and traditional hoodoo formulas, herbs, and candles. In thousands of interviews with Southern hoodoo practitioners beginning in the 1930s, Episcopal priest and folklorist Harry Middleton Hyatt found that hoodoo mixed easily with other religious systems. In a sense, it was becoming America's first boundary-free faith. Hyatt's informants frequently spoke of petitioning Catholic folk saints, historically and theologically suspect saints barely tolerated by church doctrine, but the subject of loving cults among the faithful. These included the legendary Saint Expedite, helper of those needing results in a hurry. "Well, Saint Expedite, he's very good," related one subject, in the kind of dialect Hyatt faithfully captured. "He have helped me. He helped me, and when I wants bread I call on him, and he brings me a rap," answers by rapping. "I heard that he was a man that didn't believe in no evil work, and he didn't fool round with no kind of evil doing when he was on this scene, and he was a true man, and when he died he went to heaven." The books stocked by hoodoo supply houses encompassed Christian inspirational classics, such as The Imitation of Christ, again repackaged as occult fare, or modern guides to hexes, spells, and folk cures. Folklore from the German-American community of Pennsylvania, influenced by the Rhine Valley mysticism of the Kelpius and Ephrata communes, proved especially popular among hoodoo readers. A favorite was German Pennsylvanian Johann Georg Homann's 1820 spellbook Powwows, or Long Lost Friend, a volume that made its way into English in 1855. Powwows was a haunting hodgepodge of myth, healing practices, and European folklore. The book referred to itself as a magic charm that would protect all who carried it. So seriously was this belief held that soldiers of German Pennsylvania background were known to carry powwows on them in Vietnam. Far and away the most venerated book in hoodoo was another Germanic occult text, this one assembled from myriad sources in the mid-19th century. Often considered the Hoodoo Bible, it was a beguiling patchwork called the 6th and 7th Books of Moses. The Grimoire, or Manual of Magic, served up a mixture of Kabbalah and pseudo-Kabbalah, supernatural seals, the spells used by Moses against Pharaoh, and, most popular of all, instructions on the magical uses of the Psalms. For hoodoo practitioners who discovered the book in its first English edition in 1880, it became a source of endless fascination. The 6th and 7th Books of Moses is cited more than any other single work in the interviews and oral records that survive of root workers. German, Pennsylvanian, and Jewish influences grew so woven into hoodoo practice that a Louisiana-born conjurer living in Memphis in the 1930s told folklorist Hyatt about a love spell where "you'd have to talk Hebrew-like. You realize the Hebrew language, some of that's in the 6 and 7 Books of Moses, and then the balance is in the 91 Psalms of David." Indeed, to many root workers, Moses himself was the great medicine man and conjurer of the ancient past, a savior from the African continent who used his divine powers to free and protect his flock. To hoodoo practitioners, Moses and Aaron's spells against Pharaoh revealed the true purpose of Africa's traditional esoteric crafts. A former Georgia slave named Thomas Smith put it this way in another Dialect Faithful interview, which appeared in the Georgia Writers Project Guide. "That happen in Africa, the Bible say. Ain't that show that Africa was a land of magic power since the beginning of history? Well, the descendants of Africans have the same gift to do a natural thing." The Great Voodoo Man of the Bible. The marriage of African cultural awareness, magic, and the emancipation brought by Moses found its greatest expression in the books of a man whose identity is lost to time. The 1930s and 40s saw the arrival of Henry Gamache, a pseudonymous author and literary man of mystery. His books were the finest original fare put out by the hoodoo publishers and supply houses. Gamache's works include an influential guide to candle magic called The Master Book of Candle Burning, as well as books of herb magic and protective spells. The centerpiece of the Gamache oeuvre is a little-known minor masterpiece. It is a work that has never gone out of print, and that prefigured the African religious and cultural revival of later generations. Expanding on the themes of the 6th and 7th books of Moses, it is called Mystery of the Long-Lost 8th, 9th, and 10th books of Moses. Published in 1945, Gamache's 8th, 9th, and 10th books of Moses theorized the existence of lost Mosaic works, including those that might reveal the magical systems used by Moses, the great emancipator. Gamache depicted Moses as a figure born from within the magical ferment of Egyptian and African antiquity. In so doing, Gamache developed a cultural argument that all the great Western faiths were philosophies raised up from the cradle of Africa. Moses, he reasoned, was the great voodoo man of the Bible, a medicine man and miracle worker whose fingerprints could be found in the African-descended religious movements of voodoo, hoodoo, and those that became Judaism and Christianity. All across Africa and Egypt to the Sudan and thence to the Gold Coast is his influence manifest, Gamache wrote. In Haiti, in the Western Hemisphere, the greatest of all the gods is Dambala Wedo Wedo Tokan Frida Dahomey, who is none other than Moses himself. It was a novel argument. In his analysis, Gamache previewed Afrocentrist and Garveyite perspectives that would begin to gain popularity 25 years later. And his perspective was not without subtlety. While anthropologists speculated over, and sometimes fiercely debated, the extent to which African culture retentions could be found in America, Gamache, in an approach validated by later generations of ethnographers and religious scholars, showed an understanding that the most visible African retentions could be discovered in Haiti and the Caribbean, where older customs were more closely preserved. Scholars generally attribute the greater retention of African religious traditions in the Caribbean and Latin America to the greater ratio of blacks to whites on comparatively vast plantations, as well as to the continual influx of new slaves. In America, by contrast, plantations were smaller, black-to-white ratios less, and by the start of the Civil War most North American slaves were native-born. In North America, writes historian Albert J. Roboteau, in his classic Slave Religion, a relatively small number of Africans found themselves enslaved amid a rapidly increasing native-born population whose memories of the African past grew fainter with each passing generation. The person using the name Henry Gamache may have been the force behind other pseudonymous hoodoo-influenced books, including Guides to Magic and the Occult under the bylines alternately spelled Louis de Clermont and Louis de Clermont. Indeed, Gamache's own works emerged from companies owned by the same or related retailers who controlled the de Clermont titles and a variety of other works on dreams, spells, and numerology. But a liveliness and originality that is absent from the usual supply house fare permeates Gamache's writing. suggesting the thought of a distinct, though unknown, individual. Gamache alone displays a broad interest in the religion, magic, and folklore of a vast range of cultures and belief systems, including Christian, Vedic, African, Judaic Kabbalistic, Voodoo, and Spiritualist. In an almost unheard-of device in hoodoo-oriented literature, Gamache in each of his books supplied bibliographies and cited scholarly and journalistic sources, many of which were available at the New York Public Library. He seems to have been a man of mixed race, notes Catherine Uronwoud, the canniest contemporary observer of hoodoo history and practice, possibly born in the Caribbean, who lived and worked in New York City. There is one further literary connection to Gamache that begs scrutiny, and it involves yet another magician who associated himself with the wonders of Moses. The figure who authored the Gamache books is sometimes thought to have ghost-written the memoirs of the most famous African-American stage magician of the first part of the 20th century. He could neither read nor write, but enthralled thousands of followers under the stage name Black Herman. Professor Black Herman. I am proud to introduce you to one of the greatest men of our time, the MC would announce at the opening of Black Herman's stage shows. The president of the Colored Magicians Association of America and the undisputed monarch of race magicians. All those present tonight are fortunate because the territory he tours is so large that Black Herman only comes around once every 7 years. This is the year for us all to remember. You will tell your grandchildren about this day. You know the legend of High John the Conqueror. Now meet the legendary Professor Black Herman. Although he had been born Benjamin Rucker in Amherst, Virginia, in 1892, the gangly, tuxedoed magician called Black Herman told his audiences a different story. He described a mythical childhood in a Zulu tribe and claimed great feats of magic and daring-do, including rescuing a child from a lion by hypnotizing the beast. In part of Herman's stage act, he invited audience members to tie him so he could show how, if slave traders tried to take any of my people captive, we would release ourselves using our secret knowledge. Unlike most stage magicians, who saw magic strictly as a hard-earned skill and disdained the claims of spiritualists and psychics, Herman blended stagecraft and spellcraft, casting himself as both an entertainer and a master occultist. I was born in the jungles of Africa, he intoned, where I learned the secrets of roots from the greatest tribal witch doctors. I learned the language of the animals. When I first came to this country, if I became hungry, I would merely call to a rabbit. One would come, and I would have rabbit stew. Herman would then commence with the part of his act that involved his famous animal impersonations and ventriloquism. Like his stage show, Herman's 1925 memoir and guidebook, Secrets of Magic, Mystery, and Legerdemain, was an unusual mixture of biographical myth-making, stage tricks, hoodoo formulas, astrology, and dream interpretation. It, too, framed magic as a way of resisting oppression. The cover showed a drawing of a caped Herman sitting astride a globe with a scroll marked Power in his left hand. His right foot rested atop a pile of esoteric books with the names The Missing Key, The Key to Success, The Key to Happiness, and on the largest book the words Black Herman covers the world. Herman presented a dramatic anomaly in the field of professional magic, where a black performer, when employed at all, was typically cast as a clownish sidekick to a white magician. Black assistants often distracted the audience with pratfalls designed to conceal the headliner's sleight of hand. There would be no such demeaning roles for Black Herman. He had apprenticed himself to another African-American magician, Prince Herman, and entered the spotlight after his mentor died in 1909. But Black Herman aspired to be more than a lead performer. In true hoodoo fashion, Herman positioned himself in the footsteps of the great magician Moses, playing the part of a modern-day conjurer-emancipator. In his book, possibly ghostwritten by Henry Gamache, Herman noted, "Magicians have been in existence since the days of Moses. When Moses was commanded by the Lord to deliver the Israelites from bondage, did he not come in touch with magicians? Did not the good Lord use magicians to prove to Pharaoh that he was God, and beside him there was no other? If magicians were needed in the days of Moses and Pharaoh, they are needed again at this time." Offstage, Herman presented himself as a model of worldly achievement, appearing in an elegant Prince Albert coat, tuxedo, and tails, with a pyramid-shaped amulet around his neck. In the 1920s, he was a well-known figure in New York's Harlem, living in high style amid Oriental rugs, African masks, floor-to-ceiling murals, and antiques in his 3-floor townhouse on West 136th Street. Herman claimed to readily loan money to neighbors and friends for rent and coal. He treated neighborhood kids to prizes in apple and pie-eating contests. His stage shows and occult product businesses provided full and part-time work to dozens of people. Indeed, he could pack in crowds of 4,000 a night at Marcus Garvey's Liberty Hall. His was not a race act, but a rare integrated stage show, attracting both black and white audience members. Never one for small plans, Herman dreamed of fashioning his Harlem townhouse into the headquarters of a new Negro Renaissance, and in the 1920s and 30s he presided over Sunday night salons with local businessmen, lawyers, and artists. In a move of daring and self-confidence that rivaled any shown by Houdini, Herman one day revealed the peak of his personal powers. In his invaluable history of African-American stage magicians, magical heroes, writer Jim Magus relates how Herman once outsmarted a group of thieves who were out for money and blood. One afternoon while on national tour, Herman took his brother, Andrew, to go search for his missing stage assistant, Washington Reeves. Reeves had been dispatched to a local black cemetery to gather names and dates from tombstones, providing Herman with material for his mind-reading act later that night. But Reeves was a drinker and had long gone missing. "I'm receiving a distinct psychic impression that he's drunk again," Herman told his brother. "Let's go find him." Herman and Andrew went to the local cemetery, where they were quickly approached by 4 menacing men carrying large sticks. "This is our turf," one said. "You cross it, you got to pay a tax." Herman brushed right past the men, declaring, "The great Black Herman is exempt from any such tax." The men smiled. They knew who the famous magician was and smelled big money. Gripping their clubs, they tightened around Herman and his brother. "If you're such a great magician," said one, "make us some money, now." Herman shot back, "I do not deal with materialistic matters such as money. I do, however, occasionally practice the necromantic art of raising the dead." Before the men could say anything, Herman shouted at the top of his stage voice, "Washington Reeves! Arise! Arise now!" Leaves rustled, and from behind a tombstone a figure struggled to its feet. The thieves dropped their sticks and ran in terror. Had they turned around, they would have witnessed the undead Washington Reeves stumbling forward, a pint of whiskey clutched in his hands. Poor man's psychologist. Even Black Herman encountered webs that could not be slipped out of. By the 1930s, New York State had enacted a stringent and still extant anti-fortune-telling law that prohibited the claimed or pretended use of occult powers for commercial purposes. Police spotted a very big target in Harlem's most famous magician. The law was later narrowed to target con artists who tailor predictions to cheat believers out of large sums of money, rather than storefront palm readers or psychics. While touring, Herman had known brushes with the law and usually understood how to sell his spiritual products, such as Black Herman's body tonic, with standard label disclaimers like alleged or sold as a curio only. But he hadn't expected that police would come after him on his home turf for another line of work. In Harlem, Herman offered private services as a mind reader, spiritual advisor, and root doctor. He maintained a formal waiting room and regular office hours at his townhouse. In a 1927 sting operation, a lonely wife visited Herman several times to seek help in winning back her cheating husband. Consulting with his distressed client, Herman freely prescribed hoodoo formulas and methods, including sachet powders of herbs to be worn on the body, a John the Conqueror root, magical repetitions of the Psalms, and special uses of the husband's foot scrapings to keep him home. It was a traditional hoodoo consultation, with Herman playing the role of poor man's psychologist, as he often described himself. On June 17, the jilted wife, who turned out to be an undercover policewoman by the name of Nettie Sweatman, arrested him for fortune-telling and practicing medicine without a license. Harlem healer given setback by woman cop, announced the nationally read African-American newspaper Chicago Defender the next day. It was a bitter slap to the famous magician. Another came in September from his hometown paper, the New York Amsterdam News. Black Herman, magician held for trial in special sessions as quack. In October he received a short sentence at Sing Sing prison. Herman attempted to put up a brave face for his admirers, to whom he boasted of making so many breaks from his jail cell that the authorities could barely hold him. But the humiliated Herman never quite regained his stride. As the Great Depression hit Harlem in the early 1930s, spending money and leisure time for stage shows dried up. He found ways to continue performing, often by playing to segregated audiences in tours of the Deep South. Herman got back a little of the old fire in 1930 when he visited Detroit, the Defender reported, and proclaimed that the depression enveloping the Motor City is chiefly mental, and he, being chosen by God, is seeking to lift it. While he was preparing to open a tour of Kentucky, the 42-year-old Herman died on April 17, 1934. There exist two versions of his death. One that Herman probably would have liked the world to remember, and another that was more modest. According to the more popular version, Black Herman collapsed on stage in the middle of a performance at the Old Palace Theater in Louisville, Kentucky. The stunned audience refused to leave. They believed it was all part of his act, and that the magician would rise again. When the body was sent to a local funeral home, pandemonium broke out, and police had to be called in to control thousands of mourners who wanted one last look at the stage great. Press reports and Herman's death certificate, however, indicate that Benjamin Rucker died more quietly, at the Louisville boarding house where he and his touring troupe were staying. He complained of indigestion after dinner, and when several home remedies failed to work, a doctor was called. The confusion resulted in friends telling the Chicago Defender that Herman had been felled by acute indigestion. In fact, he was dead of heart failure before he could be taken to the hospital. His body was returned home to New York, where it lies today, in Woodlawn Cemetery, in an unmarked grave.